It's time to finish our beautiful coat. This is the last episode of the sew along, and this is where we're going to put everything together, uniting the lining that's inside with the facings, just all the finishing touches. By the end, you'll have a marvelous coat. This is featuring the Lagan Coat from Itch to Stitch. Keep watching. Hi sewing friends, I'm Karina from liftingpinsandneedles.com. Welcome to this channel that is all about sewing, limitless sewing, and for the last few episodes it's been about coat sewing. I've been running a full detailed step-by-step sew along to help you sew the new pattern from Itch to Stitch called the Lagan Coat. It was released last week on Wednesday. Today, Tuesday, is the last day that it's on its release week. So today's the last day that you can get it for a little bit of a discount, 20% off. I will leave you my affiliate link down below so you can get your pattern if you still haven't got yours. An affiliate link means that if you buy through there, you will pay the price that everyone pays. You're not paying extra, but part of that sale comes back to me as commission, as a way to support the work that I do here on my channel. I've been running a full detailed sew along so you can sew your own coat as well. The instructions of the pattern are really great. There's no way you can fail following the detailed instructions. Every single step has a really nice diagram. It's really doable for you to follow along, but I know a lot of people like to see things in a visual format, and that's why I like making the videos for you. I know a lot of you benefit. So it's my pleasure to make this sew along as a gift for you so that you can achieve something really amazing in your sewing life. You can hit a milestone if you've always dreamed of making a coat. This could be your first. There's nothing extremely complex about sewing this pattern. There's a lot of long seams, there's a lot of pinning. It might be a lengthier project than others, but so worth it, and you can totally do it. Episodes 1, 2, and 3 are already up on the channel. Please don't skip them. You know, you can't just jump steps and just pick up on a certain area. It might not make sense at all. Episode 1 is a really comprehensive pattern review plus a detailed discussion about how you can approach your muslin. Lots of information there about fabric and sizing. Don't miss out on that. Episode gave you an overview of all the pattern pieces, assembling the bodice, the collar, the side seams, and the waistband. In the previous episode, episode 3, where we sewed the inseam pockets here, we finished sewing all the skirt pieces together, attaching the skirt to the bottom of the waistband, and then we set in our sleeve, two-piece sleeve, onto our coat. That's where we left off yesterday, and today we pick up with everything that goes in here. We have a back facing, we have a front facing, and then we have a lining attached. You can see that the facing has been sewn onto the lining, and I have edge stitched. This is actually the only section of the coat where I have edge stitched. All the rest has been top stitching, so I did recommend you have blind hem foot for that with a needle to the left. That's where this is going to be super handy. So we are going to see how to put the lining pieces together and then attach the lining pieces to the facings. Putting the lining together is very simple. It's totally different than the main pieces. There are no princess seams. There are only a few waist darts, center back pleat. The skirt piece is just one piece instead of several. So you see it's way simplified. Let's see.
Don't you think this is starting to wear?
The other two front facings, these have been interfaced very early on, and the back facing and the shoulder seams, they have been sewn, half an inch seam allowance. We need to press this seam open, and now we can attach this to the lining. I have sewn the lining off camera, but I'll show you the details. It's much more simple than the main coat pieces. It's got less pieces. These are the shoulder seams that have been sewn as well. This is the back piece that you can see there. The neckline was stay stitched very early on. It looks deep because it will have that facing from the main fabric there. On the center back there is a small pleat. It's about 2 inches long, and it's just sewn with a basting stitch, and from the center fold of the fabric the seam allowance in this area is 3/4 of an inch, so it's just a little fold. It's just a small pleat that you open up and then baste on the top. Looks like that, and from this side it looks like that. This basting stitch will be removed later on, and at the bottom here there is also the same type of pleat there at the waist. The back here has 2 waist darts, and then there's this, and then the back skirt piece is just one piece on the fold, different to the main coat that has many pieces. There's no waistband on this lining. Here we can see the front piece. There's a little pleat to be sewn there as well. You can see a little notch there and a little notch there that you need to match, and just do a basting stitch there. It's long stitch length, it will be removed later. There's also a waist dart and a skirt piece. There's that little notch that matches the waist start right there. So quite simple to put together, quite fast actually. And now we can sew the facing pieces to this. This is the back facing, and put a pin there to mark the center. And then we put it right sides together with the lining. Right there, match that pleat. And then we pin all the way around. It's quite a curved little area. And at some point I will snip into the lining, but not yet. I will match these shoulder seams right here. The edges of the lining don't need to be finished. The coat will be lined, so you don't need to finish or serge or do anything like that for the coat or for the lining. So I'll just take my time and pin all the way down. Along the facing you will see notches. You see that notch there, and that section has been stay stitched, and I'll do a few snips there, and then you have plenty of notches to match everything up. Very boring to look at, so I'll just get busy pinning. Here is the center front of the facing that will match the bottom there of the lining. I'm going to sew with the facing on top and the lining on the bottom. Here there's a notch on the facing and a notch on the lining. The next notch matches the waist seam there, and then further up you have that notch that will match that little pleat there. And then you go up and you find the shoulder seam, and then the center back. It's quite long. Another shoulder seam. So this will be a super long seam, 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then after sewing I can snip into there a little bit just to relieve the tension here, because there is a curve there. And I'll do some snips on the lining here on this back piece. It's very, very curved. I prefer to snip after sewing. I find that snipping before might just stretch it out a little bit, so I snip after sewing. This long seam that unites the facing to the lining, I've sewn the side seams, so it's just one long straight seam, 1/2 inch seam allowance. You can choose whichever side you want to sew the whole thing, and then on the other side you won't sew it the same, sort of the same but not really. On this other side seam below the waist seam, this is about 6 inches below, you can choose a random spot. You need to leave about an 8 to 9 inch gap. What you do is sew with a normal stitch length up to there. I marked it with chalk, reinforce, and then this section is sewn with a basting stitch, just a long stitch length. Here you reinforce again and you continue down with your normal stitch length. These basting stitches will be removed later when we want to turn the coat inside out, when this lining is attached to the main skirt. So it's important. It doesn't really matter which side you do this on. There's no right or left, whatever side you want. After doing the side seams, I have sewn in the sleeves. Now, doing the sleeve lining is the same as doing the other one. I find this one easier. You don't need extra steps like having a stay at the back or sleeve head, so it's pretty straightforward. You just put it in there and sew it. I don't think there's excessive ease here on the cap. You can see a slight gathering there, but there's no puckers, there's no pleats, nothing like that. So the two sleeves have been set in. What I'll do now, just press everything because I haven't pressed a single thing on this lining yet. You don't really need to up until this point. I'd rather leave it all to the end. Then we can sew this onto the main piece. I'm doing an optional step that you can choose to do or not. I want to do it. I pressed my lining here and I just find it doesn't lay that flat. So I'm just edge stitching it down. The seam allowance is that way, so I'm sewing on top of the seam allowance there. And I've got my presser foot that helps me sew on the edge. So that's how it's going to look. It's very neat with the presser foot, and it just helps this lie flat and not try to bubble over. You know, this is a polyester lining, so it doesn't really press that well. But this is just optional. It's not part of the instructions. Here we have the coats finalized, the main, the outer shell, and we have the lining finalized. The lining is very different to the coat. It's got less pattern pieces on the body. The sleeves are the same though, and you can see that the facing is the same as the main fabric. Now, to unite these, the first step is to put these right sides together at the bottom of the hem. So you align the hem of the main to the hem of the lining all the way across the bottom and sew that together with the same 1/2 inch seam allowance as always. We left off with having a coat and a lining there hanging next to each other. I hung them over there so you could see. And now we are going to start putting everything together. The first step of putting all this together involves the bottom, the hem. So we are going to be sewing the lining to the main coat, right sides together all along the bottom. But first we need to do a memory crease, then we need to do the hem. It's a very fun process. Let's see. Before sewing the main jacket to the lining or along the bottom edge, you need to press the hem allowance up and create a memory crease. I took my time, I measured very carefully. It's 2 inches exactly all the way along the bottom of the main coat. So that's done. You can see this is the interfaced area, and you will have a little bit of interfacing here protruding. Now we can attach this to the lining all the way along the bottom. I've pinned the lining to the coat at the bottom. Everything matches. Here's the side seam of the lining matching the side seam of the coat. And then all the way around the back of the lining, you won't have a seam, but you will have seams on the coat. The next seam that matches is the other side seam, and then the other center front. So it all matches. It's a very long seam, 1/2 inch seam allowance, just a straight seam. You need to be very accurate with this. You can't just approximate your seam allowance because it's going to have to do with how this is bagged out. So I can see my seam allowance there, and I'll be as exact as possible. After sewing these 2 layers together, the lining and the main right there, that's how it's going to look. You have that memory crease that you've done previously with the hem allowance of the coat. Fold that again, and now we need to slip stitch. We're going to do a lot of hand sewing. It's like doing the hem basically. You're going to catch both of these layers and try to catch only the interfacing bit here. And here on the center, you want to leave a gap that's open about 4 inches. That's about 10 centimeters around there. So a little before the facing. Don't sew that down. So what I'm going to do is put my hand underneath here, and I'm going to take the time to pin this sew down. I'm going to pin like this all the way along the bottom of this hem. That memory crease is really well done, so it will help you get this really accurate. When I get to the other side, that's way over here. Here's the other side. I will also leave the 4 inches open. So that's 4 inches there. We'll leave this section without slip stitching it, and all the rest from here all the way across the bottom will be slip stitched on. It's like you're doing the hem basically. There's really not that much science to slip stitching. It's the most basic stitch. I have just made a knot and pulled my thread through. And what I'm trying to do here is just catch the interfacing. This is tricot interfacing, and look, you can get a good chunk only of the interfacing and not the coat itself. And then I just catch the 2 layers of the coat there. That's one done, and I'll just do this over and over and over. Like, I'm really careful to just catch the interfacing. So I'm using quite a thin needle here, and that's it basically, all the way across the bottom. This does take a little while, but it's not hard. And then from the outside, that hemming won't be seen because you're catching the interfacing, you're not catching the actual fabric, so it'll be invisible. Of course, I say sewing by hand is really fun because I really enjoy it, but I think doing the hem by hand really elevates the garment, makes it look very elegant. If you go to a high-end shop and you want to buy a nice coat, you will never ever see a coat that's been sewn with a machine on the hems. It's just a no-no. You always do that by hand. And the fact that you're picking up the slip stitching on that piece of interfacing that you have protruding is great, because you're going to have a stable hem, but the fibers aren't being pushed through the coat material, so you won't see anything on the outside. And it's so neat, so clean. Everything's really pressed. It's beautiful. I really love the way that this was sewn at the bottom, and later you'll see that it's the same technique we used. Now that we have all the bottom, we need to unite the facing to the main all along the center front, including the collar that's going to be sandwiched in between. This area here on the top, you'll see some hand basting. And then on these center areas that are just straight, I'll be using pins. So let's put it together.
I have tried to give you my soul, but you can't.
We still have our coat with our lining right sides together, and now we go all the way up to the neckline where we have the facing here. Along the back facing, you would have done a stay stitch very early on, so you can see that stay stitching there. We just need to do a few snips here so that this can conform to the curve that we already have on the coat. The layer of the coat already has the collar stand on there, so we'll do a few snips here. And here is the coat, the main coat. Here is the stay, that's any cotton fabric, and then inside is the collar stand already sewn. This already has been snipped at an earlier stage. Now we need to match this all along. This is the center front, there is the collar peeping out, and we will match this all along the top. You will see a dot here that will match the dot right there. It has a P mark on it on the facing. So just align all these raw edges together all along the top. Basically, I'm going to take my time and pin everything. Here we have the center front of the coat. Here we have the lining. You will find notches to match along the way, and we're going to match this all the way to the bottom. This was already sewn right there. So we will sew from the bottom all the way up, pivot here at the center front. This will form a small corner. This is where the collar is in there in the middle. It'll be sandwiched all along the top neckline, conforming to this curve, reaching the other center front here, and then pinning all the way down. And it'll be another very long seam to unite the lining to the main coat. This is lengthy. It's a lengthy process, but it's not difficult at all. It's just really long seams and a lot of pinning basically, but nothing especially complex. Okay, I've taken my time, and from the bottom here I've pinned all the way up the center front and up to here. But on this curved area of the neckline, it gets quite bulky. There's quite a few layers of fabric and interfacing. I didn't want to be dealing with pins in this area, so I have basted that by hand all the way together over here. So that's hand basted, and then from here down all the way down the other center front to the bottom. So I'm just hoping my machine will cope with all these layers. I'm sure it will be fine, but it'll be another long seam coming. I have already sewn part of the center front there from the bottom all the way up to here. I have just sewn past the waistband. At the back I've got the facing, and you will see notches that match those two waistband seams, so everything lines up. It's very easy. And here I'm reaching this corner. I'm not going to pivot. I'm just going to finish that seam and then pick up and start again there, so that there's an intersection of seams that I can fold in. I think that's more stable. Then comes all this neckline where I have all the hand basting. Quite a few layers here. I finished my seam there, and where the intersection is I reinforced and just backstitched a little bit. I'll do the same here to just have a really reinforced seam. Right under there's the collar, so this area here is quite thick, lots of layers. This is so much easier to do pinless, for sure. Hand basting helps a lot. Now that I've sewn the neckline, that was the trickiest part. I was just making sure always at the back that this was staying smooth, that there was no puckers forming. It's very curved. Here on the end, I finished there and I just reinforced there. And now I'm going to start there, and then it's a really long seam all the way to the bottom. Here are the waistband pieces, and this is what I meant about there being notches on the facing that you match. So it's very easy to just pin and put together and have everything correctly. After doing that super long seam, we need to sort out the bottoms of all these centers. You can see that there is a slanted edge, and that's because there's some extra ease on this facing. We had already pressed the memory crease for the hem, so that's done. So you just need to fold this up onto itself right there. Make sure everything is smooth there. And now we are going to sew on top of all these 4 layers, right on top of this stitching line that we already have. So we're going to start there and finish at the bottom. And same on the other side. It looks very strange, but when you turn this all out, you will see that it makes perfect sense. So that seam was done exactly where the previous seam was. And then we have the other side. So we can see the crease there. I even have the notch mark still there. Fold this up onto itself. Seam allowance here can be trimmed to avoid that much bulk. So I'm just getting rid of about half of the seam allowance there. Now it's time to see about these sleeves and how they are united to the lining in here. Very similar to what we did to the bottom. We sew these pieces together first. We have the memory crease. It's very, very similar to what we did at the bottom, only tiny. Let's see. Just as we did with the bottom hem of the coat, we do the same with the sleeves. So memory crease, fold up and press. It's 2 inches there. I have my very practical tailor's board that is really handy for this. Otherwise it would be difficult to do because you can just go rolling this around. You can see that there's interfacing protruding that will allow that slip stitch to happen later, the same as it did at the bottom. But now we need to open this, and we will unite this to the lining sleeve to the bottom. Okay, we have just done that memory crease there. We'll just extend this and have it open and just have it extended. We have the sleeves out. We don't have them tucked into the coat. So this is the main, this is the lining under there. Now we have this seam here, the short seam of the sleeves, and it's the same seam here on the bottom. You need to make sure you know which seam is which. I'm going to use a matching pin. I'm going to put a green pin here and a green pin over there so that I know I'm matching the correct seams. You wouldn't want to match this to the other seam. One way to know is that this seam is pressed open on the lining and on the main sleeve, and the other seam is top stitched. And to make a difference here, on the lining I didn't top stitch, but I pressed them together. So that is another way I can know I'm matching the correct seams. So you can choose how you want to identify your seam. Just make sure you are pinning the right one to the right one. So basically what we need to do is bring this, match it here, tuck this in a little bit inside the main sleeve and match this seam. You can see the green pins are there. Match them up nicely. Keep going around and around, so you are partially tucking the lining sleeve inside here, but then you be able to pull this out. Here you match the other seam, the one that has been top stitched on the main sleeve and pressed together on the lining. Everything should match exactly. So this seems harder than it is. It is actually quite simple. Just make sure you are matching the correct seams to each other so you don't end up with the sleeve all twisted. So that's what we have. We have the lining tucked inside the main sleeve to allow you to align these right sides together, and now we are going to sew that on the round. So just make sure that you're not sewing and you're not getting pleats or anything under there, and just slip this in here and we'll sew this together with the same 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, so it looks really messy, but that's how it looks. Basically, the main sleeve is sewn onto the lining at the bottom like that. The seams are matching correctly. This is the other side coming from over here. So they're both done. Now we do the same thing that we did with the bottom hem of the coat, and it's to fold this back up. So you're going to have the lining coming up, and now you're going to slip stitch these two layers around the whole sleeve. The same slip stitch, same thing, but right here. Okay, so that's how this looks with this folded up, the slip stitching done there, and we'll just leave that for now. You can choose any of the sides of the skirt piece. You're going to have an opening from which you turn the coat inside out, commonly known as bagging the coat out. Super fun. It's a magical experience where you turn your coat inside out and it actually looks like a coat. That's what's coming next. There is a little open area where that happens. So let's see how to turn it right sides out. Remember, one of the side seams had about an 8-inch gap that was sewn only with a basting stitch. So I've put a pin there where I can see I've reinforced up to there. I have a normal stitch length, and from here down, so where I have a long stitch length, I can see this, and I'll just take my seam ripper and open this area up, because this is the gap where we are going to bag it out. It's quite a large little gap, and you do need this space because the coat is pretty big. All the fabric you're going to be turning from here. From this is where I'm going to put my hand in and bag the whole coat out. And this is a hard thing to film because it's so big, but let's see what we can do. Just put your hand in there, grab a coat. I like to not pull anything, I just like to shake things out a little bit. And it does look super crazy, but once it's all out, it's gonna be amazing. I've turned it. I'm going to put my hand back in here and grab this corner because I need to turn this properly. Remember, I had an intersection of seams. I'm going to fold this intersection onto each other just like that. Hold it and then flip it. Okay, so that's how that looks. It's not going to get pointier than that because there's quite a lot of layers and interfacing and all of that, but I think that looks pretty nice. So it is a short distance between this area and where the collar is coming out, and I'll put my hand through the lining again all the way to the other side and grab this side and do the same. I'm going to push the lining through the sleeve here, and you can see how that looks. You have vertical ease on the lining, so the lining's never going to pull. That's where it was sewn onto first, so it's very beautiful. That's one sleeve, and the other one as well. You just need to pull them through this thing. You can put your hand in there and pull the sleeve and push the lining through like that. At the bottom, remember we had this strange little seam at the end. That's how that's going to look. So this is the facing, and you'll have vertical ease on this facing here. That means it's never going to pull, and you have the vertical ease on the lining as well. Same, that's where it was sewn by machine, but then hand stitched inside, hand hemmed. It's very beautiful, very nice. And now the same on the other side. There we go. After turning it right sides out and making this little corner neat, we need to close that open area that was left there where we bagged it out. I'm going to show you exactly how I do it so it looks pretty invisible. No one will know that it's hand sewn in there. If you have any ready-to-wear garments, blazers, or coats that are lined, go and have a peek. You'll usually find a small area that's been hand sewn pretty invisibly. It's unavoidable. You have to have a way to get this out. So side seam is a nice place. We are also going to see the finishing touches of how you top stitch this area and all the way down. Final touches. What I'm going to do now is neaten up this. I'm going to press it. I'm actually going to hand baste this first to make sure the seam is right on the edge, and then I'm going to go and press this because at a later stage we are going to be top stitching this down. With the same 3/8 seam allowance, we have been top stitching everything. The other step that needs to happen is to sew this by hand to close this gap. I'll do that as invisibly as possible, but if you can see a little bit of your stitching, it doesn't really matter because this will be inside. You always will have a gap like this. Even in a store-bought coat, you will see a section that is hand sewn because there's no other way. So I will just neaten all this up because basically the only sewing that's left is that bit of hand sewing and then top stitching all of this, and then the buttonholes, and then the coat is done. I'm going to show you how I'm sewing this closed. This seam had already been pressed because it was basted before, so I do have that crease. I put them right next to each other like that, and I take my needle and I go right inside that crease as flat as I can, and then I come out on the other side and I do the same, flat there, and then I pull the thread, and that's how it's going to look, pretty invisible, because all the stitching is done right on the edge of the crease. So I'm not catching fabric here or catching fabric there. So that's it basically. Just align these edges that have been pressed previously. Catch it there, right on the fold. Catch it on the other side. And you can do several at a time. Catch it right there. Right there. You can see how the needle does like a little crossover from side to side. I would do about 3 stitches, I wouldn't do more than that, and pull, and it's going to look pretty invisible. The center of the coat has been neatened, the facing in there. What I've done here is to make sure that the facing is rolling in like a tiny bit, like a less 1/16 of an inch or something, so that you don't see the seam from the outside. It's not possible to understitch this, and it will be top stitched, so I manually just rolled the seam like that when I was hand basting. Now here, where this unites to the collar, what needs to happen is you start there, you go out like that, and where it's 3/8 there, then you pivot and turn, pivot again, and then go down, so you have that sort of shape uniting these two pieces right there. So I've changed my presser foot, the one I've been using the whole time, to help me sew with 3/8 really neatly. Now where I did this, I didn't backstitch, I just started, and I'm going to secure that by hand. I really don't want there to be a backstitch right there. You can see I've pivoted there, and the edge of this presser foot is right along the edge there, meaning I've got the correct seam allowance. Same as in this section, pivot and check if the seam allowance is right, and it is, and then go all the way down. I'm fortunate that this machine has been working well even through these thick layers. All that's left to be done is the buttonholes. I will be practicing on scraps using the same amount of layers I have here. I basically have 2 layers and they're both interfaced, so I'll be testing on that same thickness to see how my buttonholes are going to work. But there's basically one here in the center of this waistband. They are horizontal buttonholes, and then here, from here onwards, there's 2 more, one there and one there. And then on the skirt piece, there's 2 more. I use these buttons. They have an inch diameter, a good size for a coat button. You have one in the middle of the waistband, and then 2 on the top, and then 2 on the skirt. Look, if you're planning to wear your coat closed, I would suggest you customize the amount of buttons and where they're placed. So this button right here is not at my bust apex. My bust apex is right in the middle of these 2. So if I wanted to wear it closed, it's going to gape. We know whatever amount of ease there is, it's still gonna gape. So because I don't want to wear this closed and I'm gonna wear it open, and it was a pattern test, I didn't really want to make many changes. I just sewed on the original 5 buttons, but I could have sewn more, you know. I could have put 3 here on the top, that one, and then 3 on the skirt. That meant I would have 7 instead of 5. Go ahead and do that, it's your coat. I did a little test with scraps of my fabric that I also interfaced to mimic the amount of layers I'm going to have there. I even mimicked this area that is top stitched, so I know the thickness of the seam allowance in there, and then I did a practice buttonhole on my sewing machine. This is how the center front looks with the top stitching. It involves all these layers here at the bottom. This is very bulky over here as well. That's how this looks, like that. So it's like a continuation of that one there, pivot there, like that. I can remove the basting stitches, give it a good press, I'll repeat the same on the other side. This is what I've done to improve my chances of buttonhole success. This is a little piece I made to mimic what the center front is going to look. I've interfaced the scraps, I've sewn them together with the same 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then I've top stitched that 3/8 seam allowance right there so you can see. You can see my buttonhole mark in white chalk. Now, if you've lost your buttonhole marks, you can go and get your facing piece and put it on top, but remember to fold away the seam allowance of your paper, because remember, we have taken away the seam allowance already. If you forget to do that, you might end up with buttonholes that are way too far away from the center. So just make sure you do that. Fold away the 1/2 inch on your facing piece where you have the buttonhole marks. And you know, on my real coat, I had my buttonholes marked on this side with my trusty yellow coloring pencil, so the mark never really erases. I'm showing you what I have here. This is the presser foot I use for my buttonholes. In this area you can put your button. It might fit. This one barely fits, but it's supposed to make the size of the buttonhole to fit that button, but I never trust it that much. I tend to think it makes the buttonholes too big, so I'm going to try this one, and then if I find it too big, I'm just going to remove the buttonhole, just make this section smaller. Depending on what machine you have, you might have different options for buttonholes. I have 3 options right here. I'm just going to do the basic one, which is 24. On the bottom you can see that there are these plastic ridges. There is one in the center, and when you're looking at this through that way, you can see where that center is, and that's where you want to put the center of the mark that you made for your buttonhole. I'm just showing you what my machine does. Yours might be totally different, but I think this type of press foot is really common. So what I want to do here is make sure that my buttonhole is not starting on top of this bulk of the seam allowance there. But if you follow your reference marks, then you'll be fine. Now, that little plastic thing that I could see in there, I can clearly see where the center of it, and I can place this there. Put this little thing down, set my needle, make sure it's really in the middle of my mark, and I'll just press the pedal and let it go. Now, usually when I'm practicing buttonholes, I don't really sew the whole thing because I know from the get-go that this buttonhole is way too long. And it's been my experience with this presser foot. I don't want to sew an extra long buttonhole. I don't like that. I like them snug. Look, when I take my button out, look how much bigger this buttonhole is. It just doesn't need to be that big. So all I do with this is just a few clicks smaller, and I'll just make another one and see. Okay, this time I have a completed buttonhole, and I think this is going to be nice and snug for my button. I don't have any special tool to cut into buttonholes. I just don't have those things. So I'm just going to cut into it old school way. Make sure it goes in nice and snug like I like it, yes. And now if you have some fray check, you can put some fray check on the back of the buttonhole. A little bit, just a few drops. Don't go too generous with it. Let it dry and then you'll be done. So this is my experience with buttonholes. It doesn't have to be hard, especially if you have an automatic buttonhole maker. You might have a more simple machine that uses this one that has a 3-step buttonhole. And this is what I meant with having issue of getting them the right size. You can see I've got a little blue mark there. That has in the past helped me know where to stop. So this would be the more simple way, but I don't have the machine here to demonstrate that right now. I'm very fortunate that my machine has an automatic buttonhole maker. I just tap on the settings and check my size that it fits my button, and then I just press on the pedal where it does it itself. If you are scared of buttonholes and it's the only thing holding you back from making a coat, I suggest you just make your coat and get someone to do your buttonholes. Send it to someone, ask someone that knows how to do them, pay them of course. And you know, if it's the only thing holding you back, I wouldn't let something like a buttonhole hold you back from making an amazing project like this. I know in the past when I had a basic machine where I had to do a 3-step buttonhole, I could never get my buttonholes to be the same size. I just always struggled with that. Not the making buttonhole part, but actually making them the same size. And I'm so concerned about one being smaller than the other. So in the past, I have sent blazers to a professional. Can you please make 3 buttonholes for me? And they have turned out beautiful and I have been happy. So don't think that you have to do your own buttonholes. You know, it's not a complete failure if you don't want to do it. You know, you can go ahead and have someone do it and you'll be relieved, happy. Now, if you do have a machine with an automatic buttonhole maker, just make sure you practice on the exact same fabric you plan to sew them with. Practice the button, that it's the size you want, that the button's going to fit, and you are going to be fine. I'm not going to fall into that cliche of saying buttons are hard. I'm just not going to fall into that. The reason I've sent buttonholes to other people is because of the machine I had, basically. So my buttonholes are acceptable, they're nice, they're horizontal, they are big, and they fit my button. I mean, I'm never gonna wear these clothes, but they look nice, and the buttons have been stabilized with a small button on the back. This is the end. I hope you enjoyed sewing this coat along with me. I know I sewed this months ago, but I was always thinking of you while I was sewing it, and how I could show you in a way that would be super approachable, super doable, for you to just get rid of that fear and just dive into a project like this. I hope to have helped you. I really hope you make your coats. I would love it if you showed me your finished coats. Wherever you want to share, tag me. If you want to send me an email with your photo, I'd love to see them. I would really love that, and it would make me very happy. Don't forget that today is the last day. It's 20% off if you want to get it for a little bit less. My affiliate link is always down below, along with a playlist where you can click and see the 4 episodes of this sew along. I hope to have helped, and I will see you again very soon with more sewing. Bye.